Hello again. Today's topic is inflation. From Miller, this is the second part of chapter 7. I personally would prefer they be two separate chapters, unemployment and inflation. They're related, they can be related. But they're such big topics, it would be nice if they were distinct. So I'm sort of treating them as if they're distinct, although they're under the same umbrella of chapter 7. Since we're talking about inflation, I think an important thing for us to do would probably be to define the term. So I did as I often do, because we have the book definition, you can see that there. But I like to give you a different definition so that you hear it differently to help bring it home. So I go out to some highly academic ivory tower, very academic, lofty sources such as Investopedia.com. I do like to try to be funny. And get definitions for terms like this. So inflation, according to Investopedia.com, it's a fine definition here. Inflation is a quantitative measure of the rate at which the average price level of a basket of selected goods and services in an economy increases over some period of time. It is the rise of the general level of prices where a unit of currency effectively buys less than it did in prior periods. Often expressed as a percentage, inflation thus indicates a decrease in the purchasing power of a nation's currency. Inflation can be contrasted with deflation, which occurs when prices instead decline. I actually really like that definition because it captures the summary definition that I'll use in discussion all the time, which is inflation is a general rise in the level of prices. If you want the short version, there it is. Inflation is a general rise in the level of prices. That's the short version. But it also picks up on a lot of other little nuances. It talks about a basket of goods. Well, we'll see that in the United States, our go-to measure of inflation is called the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. And that is a basket of goods. It's theoretically the basket of goods that a typical consumer buys, and that's what we use as our benchmark for inflation in the United States. So I like that this definition mentions something about a basket of goods. There are other ways we could measure inflation, and that we do, but that's the go-to in the United States. So it's nice to have that in this definition, in the wordy definition. It also mentions that a unit of currency effectively buys less than it did in prior periods. And it also says it's a decrease in the purchasing power of a nation's currency. And that's something I like to try to highlight that isn't, I don't feel, terribly well highlighted in a lot of textbooks. This general rise in the level of prices means that each unit of the currency, in the US a dollar, is able to buy less, right? So for example, if I were to buy, let's say, a nice clear ruler from Staples, and this thing is $2, that means each dollar was buying a half of this product. Well, if there's inflation, and this thing goes to $3, that's part of the general rise in the level of prices. But let's think about from the dollar's point of view. A dollar used to buy half of it. Now a dollar only buys a third. The dollar got weaker. Isn't that interesting? So we could discuss inflation purely in terms of price level rises, but we could equally discuss inflation in terms of currency purchasing power diminishing. It's the back of the same coin. That pun was intended. So that's what inflation is. That's what we're exploring even more. We discussed in N. Gregory Mankew's 10 Principles of Economics that when prices rise when governments print too much money. And I said back then, that's prices rising as inflation. That's because we have this much produced in an economy, and if it's still roughly the same amount, and there used to be this many dollars, and we increase the amount of dollars, that's more dollars per item. Dollars per item would be kind of like an archaic way to say the word price, right? You could go to 7-Eleven and say, how many dollars per item? And the person behind the counter would look at you funny and say, that's $1. They would have interpreted the word price out of dollars per item. So if you have the same number of items in an economy in a given time period being produced, and we increase the number of dollars per item is higher, generally we should expect prices to be higher because they're essentially synonymous terms. So that's one source of inflation, but that's not the source listed in my notes or often explored for the rest of the semester in a macroeconomics course. I suppose the reason why is because that one's so obvious. The other two sources of inflation that we do focus on, we really dig into with aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Believe me, we're not ready for that yet. So we're going to dabble in it here with inflation now. These two sources of inflation that I'm referring to are demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. I'll tell you right now, demand pull inflation, that's the fun one. That's the one we enjoy the ride on. It works like this. If the economy's hot, what's that mean about employment? We just discussed employment. Hot economy, a lot of people are employed, right? And that means that people have money in their pockets. So what's that mean about the demand for the representative good or service in the economy? It's probably up, right? What happens when demand rises? All else held constant. Price rises. So you have people with money in their pockets bidding up the price of stuff, right? So right there, we have the kindling for the flames of inflation, just on the demand for goods and services. But wait, there's more. Because these laborers who are employed in great volume, that is, unemployment is low and employment is high during a hot economy, if you're an employer and you're facing that, that means when you need to fill a position to get more done at your firm, you're going to advertise that position, and most people already have a job. The highly qualified people are already in jobs. The people you'd like to hire already have a job. So how do you get them? You raise wages. What does that mean about the money in people's pockets? Even more. So you have a rise in wages, you have a rise in prices because of the money in people's pockets, because they are employed, and the rise in wages is raising the amount of money in their pockets. That's demand pull inflation in a nutshell. The price of everything ought to be rising when demand is high, but I'm going to burst your bubble. As I said, that's the fun one. Sometimes, maybe it's not a bursting of the bubble, because sometimes we do have that hot economy. In my lifetime, I've experienced it now really 3 times. That'd be in the mid-90s, mid to late 90s. Very hot economy. Inflation was tame. It didn't actually materialize. Demand pull inflation, I remember it being discussed because my undergraduate degree is in finance, and that's when I was in college. It just really wasn't panning out the way that theory that I just described says it should. It just wasn't there. And then in the 2005, 2003 through 2004, 2005, the economy was pretty hot before the housing bubble. We also had tame inflation. And prior to the pandemic called coronavirus, a virus name I'm very happy about because Corona is a brand that's done us wrong by advertising drinking glass out of glass bottles on the beach. I'm going to take the opportunity to shun Corona every chance I can. But prior to coronavirus, the economy was very hot. Unemployment was very low. Employment was very high. Inflation should have been happening the way I described. It just wasn't there. So that's the theory. That's why we would expect it. It just hasn't really panned out. And there are other things, other forces at play. So I mentioned there are 2 types of inflation. That was the first one that I wanted to describe, demand pull inflation. The other one's called cost push inflation. That one is not a fun ride. That one, in fact, is likely to coincide with another term that is in textbooks called stagflation. So it's in a way, it's kind of the opposite of demand pull inflation, because demand pull inflation happens when unemployment is low. Stagflation happens when unemployment is high and there is inflation. And that tends to go along with this idea of cost push inflation. Cost push inflation has happened in the 1970s due to the energy crisis. High oil prices meant that the cost of manufacturing goods and services was high, and the cost of transporting goods and services was high. So as manufacturers try to recoup those costs, they raise prices. Well, at high costs, you have low employment or a weakening economy, because with those high costs, particularly in energy, it's like a tax on the consumer, right? How much can you lower your thermostat to reduce your heating costs? You can lower it some, you can't go down to freezing, right? So when energy costs are higher, it takes away from your ability to consume other goods and services because you have to. It's a necessity to pay that. Same with transportation, driving in your cars. And if you've seen cars from the 1970s, they were big. They were big. They did not have good gas mileage. So in the short term, when the energy crisis came, if people wanted to get to work, getting to work was a necessity. It cost them more to do it. Well, that money that the high gas prices was costing them had to come from somewhere. So it cost them the consumption of other goods and services, which is the decrease in demand for the representative good. What happens, all else held constant, when you decrease demand for a good, price falls. So you had a poor economy due to the high energy costs, specifically oil, but with oil prices go other energy prices because they're substitutes for one another. So you had a poor economy, high unemployment, and high prices. That's cost push inflation in a nutshell. That one is not a fun ride. In fact, an economist whose name escapes me at the moment, it's not important to what we're doing, developed a thing called the misery index, which may or may not be in textbooks anymore because it was from the 70s and it was very interesting then. And that was a measure of putting together the unemployment numbers and inflation, because at that time both were bad, and the term misery index was just a fun little thing to think about, because that's how it felt to have high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. Miserable. So I think that's a good breaking point for this video segment as an introduction to this topic of inflation. And now we're going to start to look at the nitty-gritty, how to calculate that.